You know, usually when you're watching a movie, you wait for that one specific moment.
Right. The big villain monologue.
Exactly. The scene where they finally pace around the room and, like, explain the grand, twisted logic behind why they're doing all these terrible things.
Yeah, and we as the audience sitting there with our popcorn, we always focus on the speech itself.
Right. We focus on the words, the twisted morality, the justification. But we rarely stop to ask a much more interesting and, frankly, a much more terrifying question.
Which is what?
What were the actual material conditions 10, 20, or even 100 years ago that made that person feel like they needed to write that speech in the first place?
Oh, absolutely. We constantly mistake the justification for the origin.
Yeah.
We look at the end result of a horrific belief system like the fully formed prejudice, and we assume it just spontaneously appeared out of thin air.
Like someone just woke up one day with hate in their heart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When the reality is it's far more calculated.
So today, our mission is to unpack a dense, incredibly structured set of notes that reverse engineers that exact calculation.
It's a heavy topic.
It is. We're looking at a comprehensive analysis of the history of systemic prejudice against enslaved Africans and the African diaspora. And the big promise of this material, our goal for you as you listen today, is to hand you a universal decoder.
Right, because this isn't just a standard timeline of historical events.
No, not at all. This framework treats prejudice as what they call a full-stack operation.
Yeah, it maps it out as a highly adaptable system with distinct interlocking layers.
We're talking about triggers, narratives, systems, and justifications that, mutate over centuries to survive.
It's essentially a blueprint for how human beings create, sustain, and justify prejudice when they are under pressure.
Which means we are essentially hunting for the origin story before the villain speech.
Right. We're looking at the mechanics of how a society engineers inequality.
But before we get into the architecture of all this, before we break down how the system was actually built, we need to pause and state something unequivocally to you, our listener.
Yes, this is very important.
Today's deep dive covers historical, contemporary, and, frankly, highly politically charged analysis.
Very charged.
So we want to make it unequivocally clear that neither of us is taking a political side here.
Nope.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content. Our sole objective is to impartially report, unpack, and convey the ideas and frameworks exactly as they are contained in the original source material.
Right. We're simply your guides through the text, exploring the mechanics of the framework they provided.
Exactly. The value here is in understanding the anatomy of the argument presented in the notes, examining it objectively, layer by layer.
So let's jump right into the core thesis.
Let's do it.
The analysis introduces a hook that completely shatters the conventional way we're taught to look at history.
Yeah, the argument is that prejudice rarely, if ever, starts with an emotional hatred.
Right. It doesn't begin with a targeted group and a feeling of animosity. It starts with a material need,
A gap.
a shortage in the market. And then, only after that need is identified, a narrative is custom-built to justify filling that need through mass exploitation.
So to understand how a multi-century system of oppression actually gets built from the ground up, the framework insists we first have to look at the exact material conditions that sparked it.
What the source material calls the trigger layer.
The trigger layer, right?
Yeah.
What was the mechanical, non-emotional problem that sparked the prejudice?
To see it clearly, we have to rewind our clocks past the founding of America, past the colonial era, to the pre-1400s global context.
Because a massive misconception you hear all the time is the assumption that slavery was invented alongside the transatlantic slave trade.
Right.
But the reality is that human beings have been enslaving each other for thousands of years globally.
The Romans did it.
Yeah, the ancient Egyptians did it, empires across Asia and Africa did it.
But the critical distinction the analysis makes is about the nature of that early global slavery.
How so?
Before the 1400s, slavery was, a horrific condition, obviously, but it was not strictly race-based.
Okay.
It was almost universally tied to a specific action or event, like war, debt, or territorial conquest.
So it was like an outsider versus insider dynamic.
Exactly. You were enslaved because your kingdom lost a war or because you owed a massive debt you couldn't pay.
Got it.
The psychological framing was, this group was conquered, therefore they are enslaved. It was an unfortunate, brutal status, but it wasn't an inherent, unchangeable biological identity.
Right. The concept of race, as we understand it today, just hadn't been weaponized yet.
No, not at all.
So the obvious question is, what changed the formula? How do we get from a system based on conquest to a system based entirely on skin color?
The massive shift occurs between the 1400s and the 1800s.
Right.
European colonization of the Americas created a sudden, absolutely unprecedented demand for labor.
Because the colonial powers realized that the land in the Americas was perfect for cash crops.
Rice, sugar, tobacco, and later cotton.
But these aren't crops you can just plant and ignore.
Oh, not at all. Harvesting sugarcane, for example, is incredibly labor-intensive. It's grueling, dangerous work.
They needed immense, staggering amounts of manpower.
Right. And their first attempts at finding that manpower failed spectacularly.
They initially tried to enslave the indigenous populations of the Americas, didn't they?
They did, but those populations were declining sharply. I mean, they were utterly decimated by European diseases to which they had no immunity.
Plus the brutal exploitation they were subjected to.
Exactly, which leaves the colonial powers with a massive labor vacuum.
Wow.
You have an infinite amount of land, a booming European market desperate for sugar and tobacco, the rise of early global capitalism, and literally nobody to do the work.
So the problem was entirely economic.
Purely economic.
And this is where the framework gets really dark, but brilliantly clear. Africans weren't initially targeted because of some inherent biological fear or because Europeans looked at them and felt deeply threatened.
No.
The initial trigger was terrifyingly pragmatic.
They were geographically accessible through existing trade routes along the West African coast.
Right. And they had agricultural expertise in their home societies.
And crucially, they had immunity to many of the old world diseases that were wiping out the indigenous American populations.
So the European powers just saw a massive profit motive. And Africa was the closest, most viable resource to exploit.
That is the defining insight of the trigger layer. The trigger was not hate. The trigger was a spreadsheet.
A spreadsheet. Wow.
It's cold calculation. We have a labor shortage, we have a profit opportunity, and this population is vulnerable to our superior maritime and military technology.
So the targeted group didn't represent a challenge to existing cultural norms initially.
No, they were simply positioned in a way that made them ripe for the taking by a massive, expanding economic machinery.
The source material uses an analogy here that I think crystallizes exactly how this feels.
Oh, the video game one.
Yeah. It compares this early stage to being in defensive mode in a video game, like a tower defense game or a strategy game.
Right.
You don't even know who the specific enemy is yet, but you know you have a massive problem coming your way. In this case, an economic collapse if you don't get the crops harvested.
So you don't have time to philosophize. You just start swinging early.
Exactly. You grab the closest available resource to solve your immediate survival or profit need.
It's brutal.
It is. But I'm looking at this, and I'm struggling with a massive logical gap.
Okay, what's the gap?
If the original trigger was just cold, hard capitalism, if it was just, we need labor and we want a lot of profit, why not just be terrible employers?
Right.
Why not just use extreme indentured servitude? How exactly does an entire society pivot from a purely economic labor shortage to a deeply held religious and biological belief that an entire group of human beings is inherently inferior?
And that is the exact question that moves us from the raw initial trigger layer into the heavy machinery of this full stack operation.
Okay.
You're identifying the psychological limit of humanity. A society, no matter how greedy, cannot sustain mass generational exploitation on pure, naked greed alone.
People eventually need to sleep at night.
Exactly. They need to look at themselves in the mirror and believe they're good Christians or good citizens or enlightened thinkers.
Right.
So to do that, you need to build an architecture around the greed. You need laws to normalize the behavior so it just feels like everyday business. And you need stories to make it feel morally acceptable.
It's the architecture of oppression. You have to build the house so that the prejudice is going to live in.
And the framework breaks this architecture down into three deeply interconnected layers: the narrative layer, the system layer, and the justification layer.
Let's start with the narrative layer.
Okay, because this is where the marketing happens. The analysis points out something fascinating. Stereotypes weren't just random hateful insults thrown at a wall to see what stuck.
They were custom-built functional tools engineered to justify specific types of exploitation.
Precisely.
I want to dig into that because the contradictions in these stereotypes are glaring. Explain how they custom-built these tools.
Well, the architects of this system openly embraced massive cognitive contradictions as long as they served an economic purpose.
Okay, give me an example.
For instance, the system needed brutal, back-breaking agricultural work done from sunrise to sunset. So the narrative layer pumped out the stereotype that Africans were physically stronger, impervious to pain, and naturally suited for hard labor in the sun.
Wow. So that narrative makes the plantation owner feel fine about working people to death because, after all, it's just their nature.
Exactly, but at the exact same time, you can't have your labor force realizing they outnumber you and organizing a revolt.
Right, so you have to deny them access to reading, writing, and autonomy.
Which is where the second conflicting stereotype comes in. Right.
Simultaneously, the narrative layer framed Africans as unintelligent, emotionally simple,
Yeah.
and incapable of complex thought.
And this specifically justified denying them education, banning them from learning to read, and stripping them of any legal autonomy.
It's treating a human being exactly like a piece of farm equipment.
It really is. You praise the tractor's physical engine to justify plowing the field all day, but you say the tractor has no brain, which justifies why it desperately needs a master to sit in the driver's seat and steer it.
That's a perfect analogy.
Ah.
And it gets even more twisted when you look at the justification for extreme violence.
Okay.
You have the portrayal of the enslaved person as childlike, docile, and needing paternalistic guidance.
Right.
But the moment there is a hint of rebellion, the narrative flips on a dime. Suddenly they are framed as dangerous, savage, and inherently prone to violence.
A childlike savage.
Yes, that specific contradiction was utilized to justify absolute, totalizing control and horrific physical discipline. So the ever-present paranoia of a slave rebellion was met with the narrative that these people had to be chained and beaten, not out of cruelty, but for the safety of civilized society.
Yes.
Think about this like a modern tech startup rolling out a new product.
Okay.
You identify a user need, in this case, free labor, that's your trigger. You build the marketing campaign to convince the public it's a great idea. That's your narrative layer.
Right.
But none of that matters if the government shuts you down. You have to write the terms of service. You have to lock it in legally.
That brings us straight to the system layer, because narratives are just stories until they are codified into law and economics.
Right.
Once they are legally binding, they become self-sustaining. This is where we see the creation of the slave codes.
And these weren't just casual rules.
No, they were meticulous legal frameworks that literally redefined human beings from persons into chattel movable personal property, no different under the law than a cow or a wagon.
And the analysis points to one specific legal innovation that I think is the most insidious piece of code ever written into this system.
The 1662 law.
Yes. In 1662, Virginia passed a law stating that the status of a child would follow the status of the mother.
Which completely broke from English common law.
Exactly. Under English common law, a child's status typically came from the father.
The mechanics of that single law are devastatingly efficient. By making slavery hereditary and specifically maternal, the architects ensured an endless, self-replenishing supply of property.
Because if a white plantation owner assaulted an enslaved black woman, the resulting child was legally born a slave, adding to the owner's wealth.
Yes. You are born into the condition and you cannot legally escape it. Blackness and enslaved status became legally synonymous.
And we can't ignore the global macroeconomic engine driving this. The system layer wasn't just local laws in Virginia or Jamaica.
No, it was the triangular trade.
The global bureaucracy of human trafficking.
The mechanism was a massive, cyclical supply chain. European manufactured goods, textiles, and rum were shipped to West Africa. Those goods were traded for enslaved humans.
Right.
The humans were subjected to the horrors of the Middle Passage to the Americas, where they were forced to produce sugar, tobacco, and cotton.
And then those raw materials were shipped back to Europe to fuel the Industrial Revolution.
It wasn't just the plantation owners getting rich, it was the shipbuilders in Liverpool, the bankers in London, the textile mills in Manchester.
The system completely normalized the buying and selling of human beings as a mundane, everyday corporate bureaucracy.
Which perfectly sets up the final piece of the architecture, the justification layer.
Right, because even with the laws written down, even with the banks getting rich, human beings still experience cognitive dissonance.
Oh, constantly. The men running this system considered themselves gentlemen. They considered themselves enlightened moral figures.
So the framework breaks down how they manage to sleep peacefully at night. And what's fascinating is how the justification actually shapeshifts over time to match whatever the dominant cultural authority was.
It's highly adaptable. Early on in the colonial period, the ultimate cultural authority was religion.
Okay.
So the justification layer leaned heavily on theological arguments. They argued that slavery was a divinely ordained hierarchy.
They twisted biblical stories, like the curse of Ham.
Exactly. To claim that God himself had decreed that certain people were meant to be servants, it removed the guilt entirely. You aren't exploiting people, you are just upholding God's natural order.
But then the 1700s roll around. You have the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution.
Yeah.
Suddenly, saying God said so isn't enough for the intellectual elite in Paris or London. Science becomes the new benchmark for truth.
And the justification layer pivots seamlessly. It drops the theology and adopts pseudoscience.
Biological racism.
Yes. We see the rise of phrenology, the measuring of skulls, elaborate, entirely fabricated racial hierarchy theories claiming to have empirical, scientific proof of differences in intelligence and evolutionary development.
So the cruelty is no longer God's will, it's just biology.
Right. And later, as we move into the 19th century, it shifts again to cultural arguments, the concept of the civilizing mission or the white man's burden.
The argument that the institution of slavery was actually a benevolent school.
Yes, and that enslaved people should be grateful because they were being rescued from barbarism and introduced to Western civilization.
The psychological gymnastics are absolutely staggering.
It's incredible.
The analysis highlights a critical symptom of this cognitive dissonance. When the system was confronted with glaring evidence that contradicted the narrative, when they encountered immense black intelligence, brilliant writers, or fierce strategic acts of resistance, that evidence was entirely dismissed. If a black person was highly successful or undeniable in their brilliance, they weren't seen as proof that the biological hierarchy was a lie. They were simply written off as a freak exception to the rule.
The false cause and effect loop was hermetically sealed. The internal logic of the society was, they are enslaved, therefore they must be inherently inferior. If they weren't inferior, they wouldn't be enslaved.
They flipped the reality.
Yes, the oppression itself became the proof that the oppression was justified.
I want to pause here, because I think if you're listening to this, you might be feeling a very specific kind of discomfort.
It's a heavy realization.
It is. It is incredibly easy for us, sitting comfortably in the 21st century, to look back at history and point our fingers at the cartoonish villains.
Sure.
It's easy to condemn the wealthy plantation owners, the sociopathic ship captains, the lawmakers who wrote the slave codes. But the framework asks a much harder question.
What about everyone else?
Exactly. What about the millions of ordinary people? The masses who didn't own plantations, who were dirt poor themselves, but who still lived in and supported this society.
Right.
How does this framework explain the participation of the local baker, the small farmer, the average person on the street?
And that brings us out of the architecture and directly into the actor layer, which explores the psychology of complicity.
Okay.
And it is deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to look at human nature.
Yeah.
The system did not rely on a few evil masterminds twirling their mustaches. For a system of this magnitude to function, it required an entire ecosystem of participants.
Some were actively violent, but many were entirely passive.
Yes, and they were all driven by very different, very relatable human incentives.
Let's walk through this ecosystem because the analysis breaks these perpetrators down into 6 distinct psychological types.
6 types, right?
And I want to compare and contrast these because this is where history stops feeling like a textbook and starts feeling like a mirror.
Let's start with the most obvious group, the ones we just talked about. The opportunists.
Okay.
These are the C-suite executives of the system, the plantation owners, the investors, the transatlantic merchants.
Their core drive is pure greed, profit, and economic gain.
Right. They were highly educated. They were almost certainly aware of the extreme brutality of the system, but they justified it as just business.
Their operating mindset was a classic rationalization. The market demands this. If I don't do it and get rich, my competitor will do it and get rich.
It's corporate sociopathy.
It really is.
Yeah.
But it's the second group that really answers my question about the ordinary masses.
The system maintainers.
Yes, the system maintainers.
This is perhaps the most crucial group for understanding how the system sustained mass support. The system maintainers are status-driven.
Yeah.
These are the non-elite whites, the poor farmers, the local clerks. They might not own any enslaved people at all. They might be economically exploited by the elite plantation owners themselves, but their motivation to support the system was about social status and belonging.
It's the psychological wage of the racial hierarchy.
Exactly the mechanism. The
Yeah.
system gave them a permanent structural social floor.
So their psychological comfort, their entire sense of self-worth, rested on the thought, no matter how poor I am, no matter how bad my crops fail, at least I am legally and socially superior to that group over there.
Yes. They maintained the system because dismantling it meant they would lose the only status symbol they had left.
Contrast that status anxiety with the third group,
Mm-hmm.
the true believers.
The true believers are ideology-driven.
Okay.
These are the academics writing the pseudoscience, the religious figures preaching the curse of Ham.
Right, so their core drive isn't necessarily money or even social status.
No, it's a desperate need for meaning and order. They genuinely internally believed the hierarchy was natural, biological, or divine.
They thought they were upholding the fundamental order of the universe.
To them, disrupting the system wasn't just bad economics, it was a sin against nature.
But the group that haunts me the most, the one that I think makes all of us sweat a little bit when we look in the mirror, is the fourth group, the fearful followers.
The fearful followers are conformity-driven.
Yeah.
These are the vast majority of ordinary citizens who saw the brutality, who might have even felt a pang of moral disgust in their private thoughts, but who simply didn't question the system out loud.
Their motivation is safety.
Yes, it's the fear of punishment by the state, the fear of being socially ostracized by their neighbors, or just a deep fear of disrupting their quiet, comfortable lives.
Their internal monologue is the terrifying banality of evil. This is just how things are. I didn't invent the system. I don't want any trouble.
Just going along to get along while atrocities happen down the street.
It allows violence to become background noise.
It does.
Speaking of violence, we have to look at the sharp end of the spear. Group 5, the enforcers.
The enforcers are control-driven. These are the overseers on the plantations, the local slave patrols, the militias.
Their specific role in the ecosystem required the application of daily physical violence.
Now, some of them might have been brutal, clinical sadists who genuinely enjoyed the cruelty,
Right.
but others were likely driven by their own precarious economic survival, taking the only paying job available to them.
Regardless of their internal feelings, their core function was maintaining absolute authority and physical terror.
And finally, the analysis identifies a complex, highly nuanced sixth group, the intermediaries.
This is a vital historical nuance to understand how power corrupts across borders.
Yes, the intermediaries are context-driven or survival-driven actors.
The source specifically points to certain African kingdoms, leaders, or local merchants who actively participated in the early stages of the supply chain.
Capturing prisoners from rival groups and selling them to European merchants on the coast.
Now, I can hear a skeptical listener immediately jumping on this and saying, see,
Yeah.
it wasn't just Europeans. Africans sold Africans.
Right, that's a common talking point.
How does the framework handle that argument?
The framework addresses it head-on by looking at the mechanics of the motivation.
Okay.
The motivation of these intermediaries was deeply tied to complex regional geopolitics, existing conflict structures, and the desperate need to acquire European firearms to protect their own kingdoms from being conquered.
So they were operating under an older outsider versus insider model of war captive slavery.
Exactly. The source is very careful to state that participating in the supply chain does not mean they invented or even understood the sheer scale, the generational permanence, or the racialized caste system of European chattel slavery that awaited those captives across the ocean.
Right.
However, it brilliantly highlights the dark complexity of how a massive economic engine of oppression co-ops and incentivizes people across different cultures to act against their own broader human interests for short-term survival.
So, synthesizing all 6 of these actors, from the opportunists at the top to the fearful followers looking the other way, the profound realization here is that nobody wakes up, looks in the mirror, and says, I am the villain of human history.
No, never.
The machinery of prejudice doesn't require everyone to be a monster. It only requires enough people to chase profit, enough people to desperately cling to their social status, enough people to enforce the laws, and a massive majority of people to simply pull their heads down and not question the reality they were born into.
Moral disengagement, distance from the actual point of cruelty, and simple daily normalization allowed unimaginable atrocities to just become standard administrative bureaucracy.
Okay, so we've mapped the architecture. We understand the psychology of the actors keeping it running.
Yes.
But this leads to a massive historical collision.
How so?
If the system is this deeply ingrained into the psychological drives of society, if it's serving the greed, the status, and the order of millions of people, what happens when you rip the original trigger away? What happens in 1865, after the Civil War, when chattel slavery is legally constitutionally abolished? Does the prejudice just vanish into thin air because the ink dried on the 13th Amendment? Or does the machine panic and find a new fuel source?
If we look at the historical timeline mapped out in the framework, the answer is unequivocally the latter.
It finds new fuel.
The system did not die with emancipation. The machine experienced a catastrophic failure of its legal layer, so it mutated.
It mutated.
The source material details how the target of the prejudice constantly shapeshifted based on what the white-dominated systems most desperately needed to control in any given era.
The shape-shifting target. Let's trace that mutation.
No, wait.
The elite have just lost their legal monopoly on millions of free laborers. The system is in crisis. What is their immediate pivot during Reconstruction?
During Reconstruction, which runs roughly from 1865 to 1877, the target subgroup completely shifted.
Right.
The system was no longer targeting the enslaved laborer as property because that was legally impossible. The new target became the freed person acting as a citizen.
We are talking about formerly enslaved men claiming independent land, negotiating labor contracts, attempting to vote, and actually winning elections to public office.
Exactly, because the underlying trigger changed. The fear was no longer, we have a labor shortage.
The new trigger was the terrifying threat to the old social order. It was the fear of political and economic equality.
Precisely. From the perspective of the former plantation owners and the system maintainers, the freed people threatened everything all at once.
They threatened the cheap agricultural labor supply, they threatened the deeply ingrained racial hierarchy, and they threatened the political monopoly of the white elite in the South.
The psychological terror for the dominant group was the fear of social inversion.
The paranoid thought of, what if the roles flip? What if they treat us the way we treated them?
So to solve this new problem, the system innovates. It births the black codes, and it births economic traps like sharecropping.
And I want to explain the mechanics of sharecropping because it's rarely taught properly.
Please do.
It wasn't just a tough job. Imagine you are finally free. You have the clothes on your back, but you have no money, no land, and no tools.
Right.
The exact same plantation owner who used to own you legally comes to you and says, I will rent you a plot of land, I will advance you the seeds, and I will advance you food from my commissary store. At the end of the harvest, we split the crop, and you pay me back out of your share.
Sounds fair on the surface.
Right. But the landowner keeps the ledger. And the interest rates on the seeds and the food are mathematically rigged. So no matter how much cotton you pick, no matter how hard you work, when the ledger is balanced at the end of the year, you always owe more than you earned. You are legally bound to stay on that land until the debt is paid.
It replaced the physical chains of slavery with the invisible, inescapable chains of compounding debt.
It forced the free people back into labor conditions that mirrored slavery almost exactly, without technically violating the 13th Amendment.
And when those economic and legal traps weren't enough to stop black political participation, the system relied on extreme extrajudicial violence.
Yeah.
The analysis cites data from the Equal Justice Initiative documenting nearly 2,000 lynchings during the brief window of Reconstruction alone.
That violence wasn't random. It was a highly targeted political settlement designed to crush the new target, the black citizen.
So the system violently regroups, Reconstruction collapses, and we move into the Jim Crow era, spanning from the late 1800s all the way to the 1960s.
The target has to shift again to maintain the hierarchy.
During Jim Crow, the target broadened. The primary threat to the system was no longer just political power, it was black autonomy in any form.
The target became anyone who crossed the rigid racial lines, anyone who sought higher education, anyone who owned significant property, or anyone who built a successful independent business.
The system utilized legal segregation, literally dividing society into two separate worlds, coupled with systemic voter suppression and the constant threat of racial terror to maintain the hierarchy.
Because think about how dangerous a successful black farmer or a black military veteran is to the narrative layer.
Oh, incredibly dangerous.
If a black person is autonomous, educated, and successful, it completely incinerates the foundational narrative that they are inherently inferior and require paternalistic control.
Right. The analysis explicitly points out that the most threatened, most frequently targeted individuals during this era weren't always the poorest members of the community.
They were the landowners, the teachers, the business owners.
The people who symbolized independence were the biggest threat to the system's logic.
Which is exactly why the narrative layer had to update its software again. The old stereotype of the docile, happy slave wasn't useful anymore because they weren't slaves.
So the narrative leaned heavily, almost exclusively, into terrifying stereotypes of black criminality, predatory sexual danger, and inherent social disorder.
They needed to paint black autonomy as an existential threat to white safety to justify the violent enforcement of segregation, which included thousands more lynchings across the South.
The structural problem the system was solving was how to manage the dominant group's profound anxiety about blurred social boundaries.
But human beings aren't passive. They react.
Right.
And in the early to mid-20th century, we see one of the most massive demographic shifts in American history, the Great Migration.
Millions of black Southerners pack their bags, board trains, and move north and west to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles to escape the terror of Jim Crow.
They are seeking industrial jobs and physical safety. So when the geography changes, what happens to the target?
As millions of people migrated, the target shifted to become the black migrant who was suddenly competing for industrial jobs, for housing space, and for urban political power in northern cities.
But here is the critical evolution the framework highlights.
Yeah.
In the North, the mechanics of racism had to change.
Right, because it's no longer socially polite in the North to use explicit biological curse of Ham arguments.
The overt Southern lynch mob is looked down upon by the Northern elite. So the language of the system mutates.
It becomes heavily coded. Racism began hiding behind bureaucratic, administrative, and economic language.
The published argument was no longer about inherent inferiority. It became about protecting property values, preserving neighborhood character, and maintaining urban order.
The enforcers of the system weren't just Southern sheriffs or men in hoods anymore. They were Northern landlords, bank managers, city planners, and federal housing bureaucrats.
Let's look at the mechanics of this, specifically redlining and the Federal Housing Administration.
This is crucial.
Because again, this is often taught as just banks being mean, but it was systemic policy.
Yes.
Imagine you are a black family moving to Chicago in the 1940s. You have a good factory job, you saved up money, and you want to buy a house.
Right.
But the federal government literally drew red lines on city maps around any neighborhood where black people lived, declaring them hazardous for investment.
And the banks, following federal guidelines, completely refused to issue mortgages in those redlined areas.
And it went even deeper than the loan itself. The system embedded restrictive covenants into the actual property deeds of houses in white neighborhoods.
These were legally binding clauses that stated the house could never be sold or rented to anyone of African descent.
So you are economically blocked from improving your own neighborhood, and you are legally blocked from moving into a better one.
There is a quote from the source material that sums up the pure frustration of this era perfectly.
What's the quote?
It's like getting subbed into the game, but the scoreboard is already cooked.
Wow.
You are legally free. You moved hundreds of miles to a new, supposedly progressive city. But the banks, the local zoning boards, and the federal government have already preemptively rigged the economic foundation against you.
And the psychological layer operating behind this bureaucracy is fascinating.
Yeah.
The dominant group in the North was terrified of resource scarcity competition for jobs and homes, and the discomfort of community change.
The bureaucratic system solved this fear by preserving property values and maintaining segregated social comfort zones, but it did so in a way that granted the participants complete plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability.
A Northern bank manager could deny a loan and tell himself, I'm not prejudiced, it's just standard economic underwriting.
Completely ignoring the uncomfortable truth that the economics of inequality were being actively, artificially constructed by the state. Plausible deniability is the perfect phrase. I want to fast forward slightly to the civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s.
Right.
Because this is the moment where the oppressed group actually forces a breakthrough. They start marching, they start organizing, and they start winning major Supreme Court cases.
Right. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are passed.
The system layer of Jim Crow is dismantled. My question is, how did the narrative layer react to actually losing?
That's a great question.
If the oppressed group starts gaining ground and changing the laws, doesn't the prejudice naturally weaken?
You would logically think so. But the framework notes a highly disturbing historical rule.
What's the rule?
When oppressed groups start gaining visible power and making successful, undeniable claims on equality, prejudice does not fade away.
It does.
No, it often intensifies and recalibrates before it weakens. The system feels cornered.
The empire strikes back.
Exactly. The target subgroup during the civil rights era narrowed specifically to the activists themselves.
The students sitting at lunch counters, the organizers marching on bridges, the lawyers filing suits.
Because these individuals visibly threatened the lingering legal segregation and the symbolic dominance of white society, the narrative layer had to reframe their righteous resistance as an existential threat.
So activists were not portrayed as citizens seeking constitutional rights.
No, they were labeled as dangerous agitators, radical communists, outside troublemakers, and most importantly, criminals who were disrupting the peace.
And this is where the narrative bridge is built for the next 50 years.
Yes.
Because once you successfully reframe activists who are fighting for their rights as criminals, you lay the psychological and political groundwork for the era of mass incarceration.
As we move from the 1970s through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the source notes the targeted subgroup shifted again, this time to poor Black urban communities.
And this is where the justification layer evolves into its most sophisticated modern form.
It entirely abandons the explicit race science of the 19th century. Instead, it adopts a cold, technocratic public safety language.
This is the birth of the tough on crime and war on drugs narratives.
The political rhetoric was entirely race-neutral on its face, talking only about law and order, but the application was devastatingly targeted.
The analysis cites incredible data here. It points to Brennan Center research showing that by 1980, a Black man was about 11 times as likely as a white man to be incarcerated in the United States.
But we have to explain how the system achieved that disparity.
Right. The framework highlights a crucial data point. Self-reported drug use rates and drug selling rates did not differ significantly across racial lines.
White suburbanites and Black urbanites used and sold drugs at roughly similar rates.
Yet the arrest and incarceration rates drastically disproportionately targeted Black Americans. How did the machine do it?
It did it through systemic mechanisms like the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine.
It was the exact same drug, chemically, right?
Yes, but the form, more commonly found in impoverished urban neighborhoods, carried a mandatory sentence 100 times harsher than the form favored in wealthy suburbs.
It was achieved through hyper-targeted neighborhood sweeps, broken windows, policing that criminalized minor infractions in specific zip codes, and massive divestment in urban public resources.
Which perfectly illustrates what the framework calls the feedback loop.
This is the engine of modern systemic prejudice. Let's break this loop down step by step because it explains so much of what we see today.
Okay, step one.
Step one, the system creates the conditions. Through historical redlining, generational wealth denial, and chronically underfunded schools, the system creates concentrated poverty.
Step two, those conditions predictably produce certain outcomes. When you have extreme poverty and limited legitimate economic opportunity, you see a rise in underground survival economies and higher rates of visible street-level crime.
Step three, the system points a camera at those outcomes and uses them as empirical evidence to justify both the disproportionate militarized policing of those neighborhoods and the resurrection of the original centuries-old stereotypes about inherent criminality.
The system starves a community, punishes it for starving, and then claims the punishment is proof that the community deserved to be starved.
It feeds itself.
Fear leads to aggressive policy. Aggressive policy leads to massive enforcement disparities. Those disparities produce skewed statistics, and those skewed statistics provide the rational justification for more fear.
It's an endless, self-sustaining loop. And that brings us to the reality of the 21st century.
The era of structural racism.
Where does the machine aim its sights today?
Today, the target is remarkably broad but highly differentiated depending on which specific system you are looking at.
The notes map this out clearly across multiple sectors of American life.
Right. In the policing system, Black drivers and pedestrians are disproportionately targeted for pretextual traffic stops and use of force.
In the Democratic system, Black voters disproportionately face restrictive election contexts like closed polling places, strict ID laws, and gerrymandered districts that dilute their voting power.
In the healthcare system, Black patients face documented disparities in pain management and maternal mortality due to implicit bias.
And economically, Black families face massive systemic hurdles in wealth accumulation.
The notes cite Federal Reserve research from 2022 showing the median white-black wealth gap exceeded $220,000.
Average black households earn about half as much income, but they own only about 15 to 20% as much net wealth as white households.
And we have to explain the mechanism of why that wealth gap is so massive.
It goes back to the redlining we talked about. Wealth in America is primarily built through home equity, which is passed down from parents to children.
Right.
If your grandparents were legally barred from buying a house in a neighborhood where property values skyrocketed, they had no equity to pass down to your parents to pay for college, which means your parents had no wealth to pass down to you for a down payment on your own home.
The inequalities of the 1940s compound mathematically into the 2020s.
Because older inequalities don't just vanish when laws are updated. The legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and housing discrimination turns into a modern mathematical wealth gap.
The primary actors maintaining the system today aren't angry mobs or explicitly racist politicians. They are blind institutions operating through inherited policies, algorithms, and discretionary implicit bias.
And the modern psychological justification is what sociologists call system justification.
Right. The deep-seated societal belief that if massive inequality exists today, there must be a natural, personal, or cultural reason for it, rather than acknowledging it as the mathematical hangover of a historical system.
I want to pause here and look at what the notes call the deeper cut layer of the psychology.
Because this is profound.
The source points out that over centuries, identity itself becomes built in opposition.
Yes.
The concept of white identity in the Americas began forming explicitly in contrast to black identity. Historically, being white meant fundamentally being not enslaved.
Later, being the law-abiding citizen was defined in the cultural imagination in direct opposition to the criminal urban other.
The dominant group literally defines who they are by looking at who they are punishing. But I have to play devil's advocate here.
Okay, go for it.
The notes mention that real events, real crime, or instances of violent resistance were used as ammunition by the narrative layer. How did this framework handle the messy nuance of reality?
Right.
Not every single individual in these targeted groups was a perfect, flawless victim standing passively in the street. There was real crime. There were riots. How does the system process the messy reality of human behavior?
That is perhaps the most sensitive yet analytically vital part of the framework, the distortion layer.
Okay.
The analysis addresses this nuance head-on by explaining the core mechanism of distortion. Small, isolated events of violence, crime, or radical resistance by individuals are selectively amplified and then generalized to condemn an entire demographic group.
I love the sports analogy they use in the text to explain this.
The football team.
Yeah. Imagine you have a football team. One player on that team gets frustrated and throws a dirty punch after the whistle. It's a real punch. It happened.
Right.
But suddenly the sports media labels the entire roster as a team of dirty players. And because of that label, the referees watch that specific team with a magnifying glass for the rest of the season, throwing flags for minor infractions they ignore when the other team does it.
That is exactly how the distortion layer operates at a societal level. The system isn't reacting objectively to the behavior itself. It is interpreting the behavior through a pre-existing lens that it built centuries ago.
The framework explicitly states the correct analytical framing. Instances of violence or radicalism were seized upon to justify broader, pre-existing systems of control.
The deeply incorrect framing, the trap of prejudice, is assuming that the violence is inherently biological or cultural to the group.
A system of oppression often creates extreme poverty, which generates the very survival behaviors or reactive violence that the system later points to as retroactive justification for the oppression itself.
It's the ultimate logical trap. Which brings us perfectly to how stereotypes actually function in the modern world.
The notes dedicate a massive section to debunking these misconceptions, showing that modern stereotypes aren't just accidental mistakes in judgment. They are highly functional tools, still doing the work they were designed to do.
Let's look at a prime modern example highlighted in the text. The pervasive stereotype that systemic economic disparities are actually due to personal failure or a lack of work ethic.
We just spent the last 40 minutes detailing the historical wealth gap, the mechanics of redlining, the math of sharecropping, and systemic discrimination. We know the math.
But the function of the personal failure stereotype, the reason society keeps it alive, is that it serves a vital psychological purpose.
It shifts the blame for the inequality entirely from the systems to the individual.
It completely absolves the dominant group and the institutions they control of any responsibility to fix it.
Or look at the cultural stereotypes. The framing of black culture in certain media, purely through a lens of struggle, poverty, criminality, or negativity, while entirely ignoring the immense joy, the massive intellectual achievements, the creativity, and the literal global influence of the culture.
The function of that selective visibility isn't an accident.
No.
It is designed to subtly reinforce the ancient narrative that the group is somehow chaotic and needs to be continually managed or policed by the state.
And once you realize that stereotypes are functional tools of a system, you suddenly understand why modern organizations in the African diaspora operate exactly the way they do.
The framework maps out how different advocacy groups and movements are actually executing direct strategic counterattacks on specific layers of this historical architecture.
There is no single monolithic black agenda. It is a diverse ecosystem of resistance.
Exactly. When you look at civil rights organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund or the ACLU, you realize they are fundamentally fighting the system layer.
They're in the courtrooms battling the laws, the gerrymandering, the voting restrictions, and the institutional biases. They're trying to rewrite the terms of service.
Meanwhile, educational and cultural institutions like the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture or Black artists and filmmakers are fighting on a totally different front, the narrative layer.
They are reclaiming the historical timeline, shaping authentic identity, and actively destroying the old, custom-built stereotypes through truth and visibility.
You have economic and community development organizations fighting the legacy layer, tackling the wealth gap, fighting for fair lending, and addressing job discrimination.
And you have grassroots activist networks like Black Lives Matter fighting the feedback loop directly.
They are challenging the disproportionate policing disparities on the street level and forcing public awareness to the uncomfortable fact that the machine is still humming along.
They're all playing different specialized positions on the field, trying to dismantle and rewrite a 400-year-old system in real time.
It is law versus injustice, authentic story versus engineered stereotype, community economics versus systemic isolation.
Synthesizing everything we've talked about today, from the 1400s to right now, there is a profound and frankly heartbreaking realization embedded in this text.
It's the tragedy of respectability politics.
The realization is this: you can do everything right according to the rules of society, and you can still be targeted.
You can pull your pants up, focus on respectability, get the multiple advanced degrees, play by every single rule the dominant culture sets, and the prejudice still hits you.
Why? Because the system wasn't actually built in response to your behavior. It was built in response to an ancient economic trigger, and your identity was the target.
You can succeed wildly, and the system will just label you an exception to protect its own logic. The machine outlasts the explicit intentions of the people operating it.
So my final question for you is this: if these stereotypes, these narratives, and these biases are basically just rusted tools that were custom-built to support an old, antiquated economic system of labor and control that technically ended in 1865,
Right.
why do their effects stick around so stubbornly in our minds today, long after the laws have changed?
The answer lies in the final, sobering piece of the framework, the legacy layer.
Okay.
As the source material puts it so clearly, systems end, but their effects do not.
The specific narratives might shift, but the physical and economic structures they built linger.
Human memory fades over generations, but the mathematical impact of inequality compounds. History doesn't just disappear into the past, it echoes into the present.
When people look around at their city today and ask, why are the neighborhoods divided like this? Why is the wealth distributed like this? Why are the prisons full of this specific demographic? They often don't realize they are looking at centuries of intentional architecture stacked on top of each other.
The explicit legal rules changed, yes. But the outcomes of the old rules are still playing out in our neighborhood zoning, our family bank accounts, and the implicit biases we all carry in our subconscious.
We have just spent the last hour tracing an incredibly dark yet incredibly illuminating journey.
We started with a desperate agricultural labor shortage in the 1400s.
We watched the invention of racialized hereditary slavery. We unpacked the psychological gymnastics of ordinary people maintaining a brutal hierarchy for their own social comfort.
We tracked the mutation of the system through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the Great Migration, all the way to modern implicit bias and the staggering structural wealth gap.
And what this framework proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that systemic prejudice is not a mysterious, uncontrollable force of nature.
No, it is not a glitch in the human heart.
It is a highly repeatable, recognizable, and engineered human pattern that emerges when societies are put under pressure for resources and power.
It serves as a true universal decoder for understanding exactly how human beings build, justify, and protect inequality.
And so, as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final lingering thought, a question directly inspired by the depth of these notes.
We've just spent this entire deep dive looking backward.
We've analyzed how past generations blindly followed systems, desperately protected their own social spots, and comfortably convinced themselves that gross, brutal inequality was just how the world naturally works.
We successfully reverse engineered their villain speeches.
But if the machinery of prejudice is truly this adaptable, if we know it constantly shapeshifts to fit whatever the dominant system needs today, think about the world you interact with right now.
What current systems, what economic supply chains, or what societal hierarchies are you and I quietly participating in today simply because we haven't questioned them enough?
Take this universal decoder, step outside, and look at the world around you with fresh eyes.